Hi, and welcome to the lecture presentation for HRM 140, Part 3-1. This is the first of three sections, which we'll be covering in the coming weeks. As a whole, Part 3 deals with a hotel's duties to its guests and to others, many of which arise out of ancient common law. You may remember our discussion early on in the semester about the common law principle developed in England when inns were the only safe haven for a traveler at night. That basic tenet states that a hotel has a duty to guard the property and safety of its guests. You will also recall the way that this general rule has been modified in modernity by statutory and common law through vessels like the Civil Rights Act. This chapter again deals with recent federal legislation called the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. While the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, and other identity characteristics, it doesn't specifically mention people with disabilities, and thus the ADA, which was signed into law by President Bush in July of 1990, expands the same type of protections we see in the Civil Rights Act, in that it prohibits discrimination against individuals who are disabled, and it goes a little bit further and puts an affirmative obligation on places of public accommodation to provide suitable accommodations for those people. The ADA covers 5 areas, including employment, which we will discuss later in the semester, public services, public transportation, public accommodations, which should sound familiar after our study of the Civil Rights Act, and telecommunications services. In this chapter, we are primarily concerned with Title III, which covers public accommodations. Our competencies today include understanding the purpose of the Act and how it affects lodging and food service establishments, a description of the full enjoyment and auxiliary aids or services requirements of the Act, a summary of what is considered readily achievable under the Act, an explanation of the path of travel requirements and the ADA's enforcement mechanisms. Before we jump in, I want to point out that I have provided you with the text of the Act, as well as a very helpful link to the Department of Justice website, and we'll be referring to these throughout our study. We've already discussed in general terms the answer to our first competency regarding the purpose of the ADA. But let's go ahead and take a look at the actual language of the Act, which states that the purpose of the ADA is to prohibit discrimination on the basis of a disability by public accommodations and required facilities to be designed, constructed, and altered in compliance with the Act. So as you can see, the language is similar to Title II of the Civil Rights Act in that it is prohibiting discrimination based on a person's identity, or in this case, an identifying characteristic. If you remember our discussion of the Civil Rights Act, we talked about the idea that you can't limit someone's ability to do something based on their identity. Think of the Rosa Parks case. Said another way, you can't limit their ability to participate in the full enjoyment of their rights. And this is the language we see the DOJ talk about in their guidance, which states, people with disability are entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations that a place of public accommodation provides to its customers. Before we move on, I want to talk about what businesses are covered and who is protected under the ADA. First of all, you should be familiar with the term public accommodations at this point. Essentially, this is a really broad category which the DOJ describes as businesses that provide goods or services to the public. The types of businesses are listed in the Act, but you can be sure that restaurants, bars, and hotels are included. Next, who is protected under the ADA? Per the language of the Act, anyone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. Again, this is an intentionally and incredibly broad definition, which takes into account that somewhere around 18% or 50 million Americans have some type of disability. Some examples of the coverage, and this is by no means an exhausted list, include those with visual, speech, or hearing impairments, cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, diabetes, learning disabilities, and the list just goes on and on. We now know the purpose of the ADA and who is covered and who is protected. And now we're going to discuss what is required for compliance. Let's talk first about what the DOJ refers to as general non-discrimination requirements. Again, keep in mind here that the goal is to allow individuals with disabilities to fully enjoy your business and what it offers. And so the ADA requires that you make quote-unquote reasonable modifications to the way you do things to make it possible for a customer with a disability to access those goods and services. Pinning down what is reasonable is never easy, and the study of that topic is simply beyond the scope of this class. However, the DOJ guidance provides some examples, such as a daycare center that has 2 scheduled snack times. Well, they must modify that policy to allow a child with diabetes to bring food for an extra snack time if necessary. The clothing store should modify a policy permitting one person at a time in a dressing room for a person with a disability who needs a companion's assistance to try on clothes. Another example might be a standard no pets policy. Businesses must make accommodations for service animals. There are also reasonable accommodations dealing with communications, like writing down casual notes, using sign language experts, relay services, or Braille next to elevator or on menus. The ADA also makes a distinction between existing businesses and new businesses or new construction. Existing businesses may be required to alter their physical structures so long as the changes are readily achievable. That's a very important term, but also one that is subject of much litigation. Some examples might deal with making a business accessible to individuals in wheelchairs or using walkers, things like widening doorways, removing steps and installing ramps, providing curbside service where possible, or simple things like rearranging furniture. The ADA actually prioritizes the removal of certain barriers, especially when they involve access or entry to the business, like parking lots, entryway doors, sidewalks, aisles, and things like that. Anything that impedes entrance to or access to primary goods and services like guest rooms, meeting rooms, restaurants, and restrooms. I made mention earlier of the difference the way the ADA treats existing businesses or existing buildings and new construction. While the ADA recognizes that existing businesses may be hard-pressed to make structural or design changes, the opportunity for newly constructed businesses is there to get it right from the beginning. In other words, when constructing a new building which falls under the auspices of public accommodation, the requirements of the ADA are going to be much more stringent. The ADA requires that all new facilities built by public accommodations, including small businesses, must be accessible and usable by people with disabilities. And you're going to see these types of rules ensconced in local building codes. The last thing we need to talk about is enforcement of the Act. The DOJ has primary responsibility for enforcement and uses the full force of the law to ensure compliance. The federal courts can award compensatory damages as well as civil penalties of up to $55,000 for the first and $110,000 for any subsequent violation of the Act, and that's per violation. These enforcement actions are usually started by a complaint filed by an individual with the DOJ. But it is important that you understand that individuals may also file lawsuits of their own accord, and they can obtain court-ordered injunctive relief and monetary damages against your business. So that covers the very basics of the ADA and completes our review of the competencies we laid out at the beginning of this lecture. I encourage you to review the additional materials in depth. Pay special attention to the information on the DOJ website. This is a valuable tool that you would be wise to get familiar with. As always, I hope you have a great day and that you won't hesitate to reach out with questions.